So that what was really happening is that I had the desire to actually quit. However, there's this functional intent to continue smoking, but I'm not aware that I have this intent. Now, what does that look like? Well, my intent then becomes unknown to me, right? Obviously, what ends up happening then is that my intent becomes unknown to me. I don't recognize that I actually have that intent. I think that my intent is to quit smoking, but that's not what ends up happening. I have the intent to quit smoking, but I continue to smoke, right? This is the act. So I have the intent to quit smoking, but the act is that I continue to smoke. What I don't realize, what I'm unaware, or what's unknown is that I have the, unbeknownst to me, the actual desire to continue smoking, and thus that's why my act is to continue smoking. So this is a functional intent, but it's unaware to me, it's unknown, right? Hence the problem of akrasia. I don't recognize that I actually have this intent, right? I don't recognize that I want this to actually be my action. And since I don't recognize it, it becomes my act, and I'm thinking, I thought this is what I wanted, right? I thought I really wanted to quit, when in actuality I didn't. Now, with respect to that, what we recognize is that what I suggested, or what I thought was my true intent, what I really wanted to do, I really want to quit, I really want to quit, I really want to quit. I think that this is actually operative, right? So I think that it's operative, but actually it isn't, right? It's not operative at all. So that my perceived intent, so this is the perceived intent, my perceived intent is non-functional. My perceived intent is non-functional. I think to myself that I have the intent to quit smoking. However, my act is that I continue to smoke. This is what my perceived intent is, but though it is perceived, it has no function, right? It has no force, it has no emotive. It doesn't get me to do what I want it to do, right? Which is the act of quitting. So what ends up happening is the emphasis is placed then, when we're discussing intent, the emphasis is placed not on the perception of intent. It's not whether or not I am aware or unaware. That's important. It's whether the intent is functional or not, right? The functional intent, says one school of thought, the functional intent will motivate the acratic individual to cease being acratic and act accordingly. The functional intent will be the recognition that I have the desire to quit smoking. I know that I have the desire, so this would change to, I know I have the desire, and that action corresponds. So it's just X and X. The acratic individual has a desire to quit, a desire to do whatever it might be. However, the corresponding action is different, right? I have the desire to quit. My action is that I continue to smoking, hence I'm acratic, right? So it's important to understand that. The reason why I said it's more complicated than simply describing it as a weakness of will, because the weakness of will doesn't really characterize the separation. And what's important now is that we can stop looking at any individual, right? We can stop looking at any particular human, and we can sort of do what's known as a meta-analysis, right? Not an analysis of akrasia. We know what akrasia, not an analysis of what akrasia is. Akrasia is the disassociation between an individual's intent and the corresponding action. For example, the intent to quit smoking, however, followed by the act of continual smoking, is a representation of being acratic. So that would be akrasia. That's not a meta-analysis, that's just an analysis. The meta-analysis would be an analysis of akrasia. What is akrasia? What does it mean to be acratic, right? Well, if we're talking about that, we don't really need to look at any human being. We don't need to, it's called instantiation, right? We don't need to instantiate it within any particular example or any particular person. Now that you understand what it means to be acratic, we can look more into the manifestation of akrasia as such, as a concept, as a theory. Okay, Akrasia, we can divide it, obviously, between intent and action. Right? So if we're going to talk about Akrasia, we can divide it between intent and act, and we can talk about this with respect to just any Akratic individual and any particular instantiation of the weakness of will. So obviously we recognize that Akrasia results from an unknown intent which results in known action. Right? I have an unknown intent. However, I know that the action is known, right? I have the intent, unbeknownst to me, to actually continue smoking. The act is obvious, I continue smoking. So that whatever we're describing with respect to Akrasia, we recognize that the intent is unknown, but the action is known. The next thing that we recognize is that if it's the case that actions follow from intent, right? If it's the case that actions necessarily sort of follow from intent, then we have to realize that when we're talking about the Akratic individual, it's not only what is known, but what is actually functional, right? What is actually functional, right? So the first caveat is a big if, right? If it's the case that actions follow from intent, then it has to be the case that we're talking about the functionality of an intent. So, functional intent. If we have a functional intent, the question is, what is the corresponding action? Well, if the intent is functional, we have to recognize that if the intent is functional, then the action has to follow from that functional act, from that functional intent, right? So if the intent is functional, the act follows from this, right? So if the intent is functional, the act must follow. Obviously, as I said before, this is the big assumption is if it's the case that actions follow from intent. If that's the case, then it has to be the case that functional intent results in actions that must follow, right? If my intent is functional, then the act has to follow. However, we recognize that with respect to Akrasia, this is not the case, right? Functional intent, the act must follow. However, I don't know whether or not this is my actual intent. So what I have is an unknown intent unknown functional int. I have an unknown functional intent and a known action. Right? I have an unknown functional intent and a known action. So what I end up realizing is, what does this mean? Well, there is something that's functional. We recognize that if something is functional, if I have a functional intent, then the action must follow. This is not a case of Akrasia. This is, I have the desire to do X, and I do X, right? Functional intent leads to an act that must follow. If I have an unknown functional intent, that means I do not know that this intent is functional, then unbeknownst to me, I actually have a secondary intent, right? I think that this is the functional intent. I think this is what I really want to do. However, this is what's really functional. And what ends up happening is that I don't quit, right? So this is how that works.